Hello, great. It is great to be here with so many people I've tried to hire before. Awesome to be in the Product Marketing Summit. I'm Mike Polner, and today I'm going to be talking about the lessons I've learned in navigating hypergrowth at Uber Eats. But first, I want to just take a second to recognize that product marketing is really having a moment. And when I think about the types of marketing that exist in the world, there are brand marketers and creative marketers and product marketers. And when you think about the future of the marketing organizations, it's not just going to be brand marketers or brand evangelists. It's going to have to be people who can understand product and technology and marketing. And there's no function that's better suited to that than product marketing. So today, a lot of people are talking about lessons learned. Lessons learned building product marketing, lessons learned scaling product marketing teams, changing product marketing teams, all these different things. And for me, like a product marketer, I had to think, what am I best suited to talk about? And that's hypergrowth. I was the first product marketer hired in San Francisco for Uber Eats, which is the startup within Uber. And we went from 1 PMM to 12 PMMs in about a year. So a lot of change happened in that period of time, and I had to figure out my own lessons, both personal and professional, and how to manage hypergrowth efficiently and effectively. So I'll talk about those team lessons and how to build an effective team culture, hire and scale processes efficiently, and how to get work done in a hypergrowth environment. But very quickly, a little bit on my background. So I started in marketing. I actually studied marketing. I've always loved marketing, and I've worked in both small startups as well as larger organizations. I worked at a company called 5 Stars, where I was about the 40th employee, and 5 Stars came out of Y Combinator, and we went from about 40 people to about 350 people in about 2.5 years. So that was my first taste of hypergrowth. And then at Uber Eats, everything just became 10x'd. Like I said, when I started at Uber Eats, the company wasn't what it was today. It was much smaller. Everything was being done for the very first time. And we were constantly changing and iterating into the app and the experience that hopefully everybody has used today. So what my career path looks like and what it looks like on LinkedIn is marketing job, studied marketing, progressively more and more marketing. Finally, I have this great job at Uber, which I'm so lucky to have in marketing. And this is what it looks like from the outside. But the reality is that's not what it felt like. And there's a lesson in hypergrowth because everything changes. And what it looks like on the outside doesn't necessarily reflect what's happening on the inside. The reality was I was thinking, what do I want to do when I grow up? Should I move to Europe and start a blog? Should I teach? Should I go into sales? Should I make American-made baseball caps, which was a real consideration of mine? And then finally now at Uber, these last 3 years have been really difficult. So again, the outside perception of what a career can look like, marketing, 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 and then the reality is so different. And that brings me to my first lesson, and that's nobody knows. Nobody knows. I talk to a lot of people who are interested in getting into marketing or product marketing, and they're saying, hey, should I take this job or should I take this job? How do I get into product marketing? What's the best path to get into product marketing? The reality is nobody knows, and I didn't totally know. So if I didn't know and my career and my path looked so linear, nobody can know. And you need to get comfortable with not knowing. And when I think about hypergrowth and what it's been like in the last 3 years at Uber Eats, I never knew, and I had to become comfortable with that. Because in a hypergrowth environment, everything you're doing is being done for the very first time. You're going from 0 to 1. And sometimes 1 is greater than 0, even if it's less than 100. Everything is changing all the time. So the first lesson is you have to be comfortable not knowing and acknowledge that. So for my second lesson, now that you recognize how you can act, it's really important as a team grows and scales to reflect that culture on everybody else. So the second lesson is you need to build a culture deliberately. And I always say you can't luck into a great culture, but you can accident your way into a bad one. So we're going to talk about a couple lessons in how to build this great culture. People have written a lot of books on culture, and I hope everybody's read them. Some of them are fantastic. But people say character is what happens when you're not looking. But for me, this is what culture is. And this is the importance of culture, because when you're 2 or 3 people as a head of marketing or as a marketing lead, you have a lot of oversight and you are the culture. But when you're 16 or 17 people in multiple different offices around the world, it's not as easy as you just turn around and saying, hey, do this or don't do this. So that's where your culture has to come in, and that's what has to grow and scale. People don't scale, but culture does, and it can become a competitive advantage. So I'll talk about these 3 steps and how to do it. The first is defining it, the second is documenting it, and the third is reinforcing it. So define it. It's really important to think about the type of culture that you want to build and the type of culture that will fit your business. At Uber, I wanted to build a culture of hard problems being solved by smart people and being able to deal with a chaotic, ambiguous environment, because that's kind of what Uber is. So you have to think about the kind of culture you want. That might not work at every company. If you're a larger organization and you're going through a period of hypergrowth, it might be just as important for you to think of a place where everybody's an owner, or where there are only a couple people who are the set defined owners and they tell everybody else what to do. Again, there isn't a right or wrong culture, it's just what matters for your business and how to fit that. Documenting it. This is a really critical step, and defining it and documenting it are actually quite different. So when I say document it, what this means, and the process that we took at Uber Eats, was saying, hey, this is a culture that you all have. This isn't my culture, this is yours. What about this culture do you like? And people said things like, I love that it's collaborative. I love that we work on these hard problems. I love that everybody kind of races everybody else up and not tears people down. And we went through the process and we documented it. And we codified those principles into a set of principles that the team now operates by. We collaborate, we don't compete. We ask why. We connect the dots. We celebrate wins. And we set the bar. And when you document that process and you work with your team to document that process, that is no longer your culture, that is theirs. And people talk about having culture champions. But frankly, I don't think that's a thing. Everybody should be a culture champion, and they should have an input into that culture, because it's not just you defining it, it's everybody. And finally, reinforcing it. So we do monthly product marketing team meetings, and in these meetings we say, hey, who has some shout outs and wins? People will shout out things that are going well, and they'll actually say, hey, this was a great example of collaborating. This was a great example of asking hard questions. This was a great example of celebrating this win together. So together, all 3 of those things ended up creating what I call the talent flywheel. And what this is it helps a couple things. First, it creates a more efficient hiring process. Nobody joins Goldman Sachs expecting you're going to be working 30 hours a week. Just like I hope nobody joins Uber thinking everything's going to be figured out. And it's not necessarily just defining that, it's actually saying, hey, this is the set of expectations that make the organization run and function. So your hiring process becomes more efficient. The second point is your team feels more fulfilled. Again, this isn't the culture that I define, it's the culture that they define. And they have a massive opportunity to change the things that they don't like and try and adjust those and reinforce the things that they do. And finally, it helps improve retention. It's a very competitive market out there for product marketers right now. But I'm happy to say that in all the time that we've built Uber Eats, we haven't lost a single PMM. And a lot of that is because people talk about the incredible culture that exists on the team. So doing these 3 things together sets up a collaborative culture, and you're set up for hypergrowth. Now, it's important to be able to build up a culture, but it's also important to recognize that things need to change in a hypergrowth environment. And what got you here isn't going to get you there. So this lesson is around changing everything all the time and revisiting things. So the rate of organizational change must equal the rate of business change. And I'll talk about this. Every time a team doubles, it's effectively a new team. From 4 to 8, 8 to 16, 16 to 32, it's effectively a new team. So you have to do things differently every time. So this is your business growth. You're growing this quickly as a business. And this is your organizational growth. And not just headcount, but the processes and the way you're doing your work. This is your debt. And you don't want that debt. So again, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to scale headcount linearly. What it does mean is that you need to rethink the things that have gotten you to the point that you're at and reinvent yourself as an organization. So there are a couple warning signs that can highlight the debt that's accumulated. Some are more obvious than others. The first one is people stop showing up. And this is very real. People stop showing up to meetings, people stop responding to emails, people start taking Fridays off, whatever this is. People just stop showing up, and that happens. If you have a culture of feedback, people will tell you, hey, this feels different, things aren't working, and something's weird. If you do regular pulse or sentiment surveys, you can identify that your NPS is dropping, or that the sentiment is around that things just aren't working the way they used to. The third one, and I think this is a really important one, is people feel out of the loop. When you're 2 or 3 people and you're communicating with an organization or within an organization, you can turn to this person and say, hey, this is the news. When you have 16 people in multiple different offices around the world, the way you communicate has to be very different. And finally, your top performers stop top performing. And this is important because sometimes you have to revisit the people who were the top performers, and will they be the top performers in this new organization as well? So the solution is you need to constantly revisit everything. You need to think about these things. So the first one is team meetings. Again, when you're 2 or 3 people, your team meeting is a couple people gather around a table. When you're 16, you have to be much more organized around how you run and operate a team meeting. Goals. When you have a small team, you can have one person own multiple goals, but when you have a bigger team, you might have actually different people owning one goal in somewhat of a competition fashion. So not every goal has to align. The third one, internal communications, memos and offsites. On the offsite point, again, 2, 3 people, you go up to Napa, you have a great time, you do some content, that's your offsite. 16 people, people fly in, it's a totally different experience. You have to revisit that all the time. And finally, your team structure. Again, the people who you're hiring and that you're building may not be the right people for the organization in the future. When you're just starting, you're thinking about the athletes, the person who can do everything and fill all these gaps. But when you're a much larger team and there's a smaller piece for everybody, you have to be thinking about specialists, people who can execute at this very high level in this one particular task. So that's the way you have to be thinking about your organizational change and revisiting these systems and processes, and what's gotten you here won't necessarily get you there. So for my 4th lesson, you need to think about how to bring the right people into your organization. This is how hiring has to work. So we've talked about how you build a culture, you talked about how you can change a culture, now you talk about the type of people you want to bring into that culture. So this is screening for signal on skill, not for job fit. In my first year at Uber Eats, I interviewed over 100 product marketers. I was sending emails to people, I was having conversations, phone screens all the time. And it's also really important for you to recognize that the process and the system that you design has to help you get signal on the skills that you're looking for, and not just looking for a job description, for example. So we had to change the process to get this throughout as we've grown and scaled. When we used to hire people, we would ask them to fill out a case study. We'd say, hey, here's your case study, take 2 weeks and fill out this case study. They'd fill out a case study, we'd look at the case study and say, this is a good case study, come on site, this is your final interview. But when you're optimizing for an ambiguous culture where things are changing all the time, that isn't going to give you signal on people who can work with things on the fly. So we actually changed our interview process to say, hey, we have these 5 questions, this is the case. If you want to go and fill out this deck in advance, that's great, and present it. If you want to do it live on site, that's also fine. And you've seen very different type of candidates come through each of those. And the people who do it live are the people who can work with this process on the fly, and they are prepared, but they're just able to kind of move quickly through this ambiguous environment. So you're moving from a place where you're saying, can this person do this job? Have they done this job? What's their experience doing this job? Tell me about a time you've done this job. Instead, to how sure are you that they have amazing product sense? And part of this is also recognizing people's weaknesses. And they're not necessarily weaknesses. It's just identifying what they're great at and what they're not as great at, and then finding the right role for them. So you need to design that process around the skills that you want to find. Again, at Uber, we have a lot of ambiguous problems. And giving a case study on a launch of a product that you've done in the past might not be the best test of that. Instead, we say, hey, we're launching Uber Laundry and Dry Cleaning, which we're not doing. But we're launching Uber and Laundry and Dry Cleaning. Think about how would you do this? What is this really complicated problem? How do you break it down and figure it out from scratch? Because those are the types of problems that we're solving. So I'll walk through an example here. Let's say we're hiring a growth PMM. And you say the top 3 skills that are required are you want this person to be hyper analytical, you want them to be metrics driven, and you want them to have strong product intuition. Now, this set of skills can be different for whatever role you're looking for. It's just important to understand what you're optimizing for and what you're not optimizing for. Then you usually when somebody's great at one thing, it means that they're not as great at something else. It's not a good or a bad, it just means that they're different. So if you are hyper analytical and you're hyper creative, please email me at mike.polner@uber.com. I'm actively hiring. So think about these 2 different skill sets and what you're optimizing for. Hyper analytical, hyper creative. Metrics driven versus narrative driven. Strong product intuition versus strong marketing intuition. Again, this can be different for a growth PMM versus a brand marketer, for example. And then your job is to get signal on skill. And you want to be sure, or as sure as possible, to understand what somebody's great at and what they want to spend their time on, and what somebody isn't going to want to spend their time on, and what they're not as optimized towards. So in this example, you found out, yes, I'm sure all the people who we have interviewed with say this person is hyper analytical. Conversely, they're also not hyper creative, and that's okay for this specific role. Maybe for a different role, you know that. The worst thing that can happen is you get weak signal. And again, part of this is the type of people and the interviewers that you have on this panel. If you're optimizing for a growth product marketer, maybe don't load up the panel with brand marketers and creative and brand folks. Instead, put data scientists, engineers, product managers. Again, figure what you're optimizing for and build your process around that. And then finally, it's totally okay if somebody is a good mix of both product and marketing intuition, and you know that. Again, the important thing is to come in and say, hey, this is what your superpower is, this is what you tell me your superpower is, we're pretty sure that this is the right fit, that's the right way to move forward. A couple other things I look for when interviewing people. The first is, can the candidate articulate trade-offs? Can they understand when they make a decision in product marketing, what the implications are across all sides of the marketplace? Again, Uber Eats is a 3-sided marketplace. We have consumers, we have couriers, and we have restaurants. And when you move one thing over here, it moves all kinds of things over here. So it's really important to recognize, can somebody articulate these trade-offs, and do they know why they're making these decisions? The second one is, can the candidate prioritize? I cannot even tell you how many times people come into cases with this laundry list of marketing activities. They're great ideas, but really, tell me what's the most important one. Tell me the one thing that you want to do, or the one that you want to do first. So can that candidate prioritize? Third, can the candidate draw a line from goal to strategy to execution? This is really important. If you say you're going to acquire 1 million college students, and you say my strategy is doing this in college students, talk about how you're going to execute that strategy and draw that line from the beginning all the way to the end. And finally, will the candidate give up when it's hard? Because Uber's hard. So this is something we have to be thinking about and optimizing for. A couple ways I like to find out and get signal on this. The first one is the design decisions and customer implications. Again, you move this needle, you change this, you pull this lever, what happens to the other sides of the marketplace? What are the implications for the customer? Second, if you can only do one thing, what is it? Why? Prioritize. Again, it's nice to say these are all the things, but give me the one, or what is your biggest bet? Because there are limited resources and there are limited time that we have to execute this. That brings me to my third point. How long to execute? You lay out a beautiful go-to-market plan. It's going to take 6 months. That's fantastic. What happens if we only have 2? What do you do differently? What do you trade off? Articulate those values and articulate those trade-offs. And then finally, a story of overcoming adversity. This is actually my favorite question to ask people. And I've changed my mind based on what people have said only because of this question. because adversity exists everywhere, and it certainly exists at Uber, and probably in a lot of your companies as well. So that's how we approach hiring as a process. And this last lesson, I think, is particularly true in hyper-growth environments, and may not be true everywhere, but in a hyper-growth environment, I'm sure it is. And that's roles and responsibilities are frankly bullshit. Because I've done RACIs, and I've done DACIs, I've done flowcharts and process diagrams, I've presented at all hands, and I've done Excel docs, I've done everything imaginable to define what product marketing is and what we own versus brand marketing versus channel marketing, and the reality is it's never crystal clear, and I've done everything to try and do this. So sometimes people say, hey, I need this really clear environment, I need the role and responsibility, and there is a place where that exists. That's an assembly line. And they say, pull this lever, and then you pull this lever, and then you pull this lever. And that might be fine for some places, but again, in a hyper-growth environment, assembly lines don't work because there aren't enough people, the processes aren't well-defined enough, and generally, the problems are too ambiguous. They've never been solved before. So it's not to say that that can't work some places, but it is to say in a hyper-growth environment, you have to be comfortable with those roles and responsibilities flexing. If a brand marketer is better at something than a product marketer is, that's okay. Talk to each other and collaborate to find the right answer. And that's the right solution in this environment. It's never super clear. So get in the room with the brand marketer. If that's their superpower and your superpower is doing something different, work together on that. If there's a growth marketer who's better at this than you are, that's okay as well. Collaborate on that. It is important to say who's making these final decisions, but it's never clear how to get to them. There's never a cut and dry process. So it's really important to have this collaborative culture and for everybody to work together. And it's your job as a leader to find the right pieces and have the right people work together on these hard problems. And like I say, there's never just one person getting all the credit. It's always a collaboration. It's always a team effort. So it's really important to remember this. So you need to let the best answer win, not the best role. So I've covered a couple lessons here. The first one is nobody knows. The answer is to learn to be comfortable with ambiguity. It's really hard, but you just have to accept that it's hard. The second is build a culture deliberately. Define, document, reinforce that. The third is the rate of your organizational change must equal the rate of your business growth. You need to revisit everything all the time, always. Always be thinking about what you can be doing better, because what got you here is not going to get you there. Fourth, don't hire just for the past experience. You've done product marketing, that's fantastic. Instead, design your interview process around how to get confidence on the skills that you need. And finally, roles and responsibilities, hypergrowth, kind of BS. Let the best answer win. And one final lesson that I've learned at Uber is embrace the challenge. The last 3 years at Uber have been the most challenging, stressful, worrying, busy time of my entire career, but I've loved every second of it because the hardest problems are the only ones worth solving. So find your own hard problems and solve them. Thank you.
Sure. Any questions? We got a few minutes.
Yes. It's never super simple to find out, hey, are you going to give up? The question I always ask is, tell me, I actually say, everybody has adversity. And sometimes it's personal adversity, I was a fat kid growing up, or it's professional adversity of a time that you've really struggled. So tell me about a time that you faced adversity and what did you do to overcome that? And you get some really real responses, which I think is actually the best type of response. But yeah, generally I think that's the question I like to ask. Yeah.
How do you know which responsibilities to divvy off when you go from 1 PMM to 2 or 3? The beginning seems like a difficult part of when to switch everything out.
Yeah, so again, I would kind of reflect on the lesson that it's never super clear. And I just try and set that expectation with everybody that those roles and responsibilities are going to change a couple times. Again, the type of people that I think I hired or tried to hire at 3 People was the athlete. Somebody who can fill this role or fill this role. And then as you grow and you scale, you kind of start to recognize where people like to spend their time, where some people don't like to spend their time, and what they're great at and what they probably won't be as great at in the future. So I try and think about that and how that grows and scales over time. Yeah, great question.
You mentioned a lot of practices around building your own culture within the team, hiring specific to the team. How does that, or does it conflict with Uber's overall, positioning of how they hire, what their culture is? Does it persist or conflict?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Building a startup within a broader business is really hard. And I think we actually got to learn a lot from the rides business of things that they optimized for and then didn't optimize for. And we learned those lessons on Eats. I think the reality is everybody is one Uber employee. And I think that there are these nuanced differences in cultures from Eats to rides to Jump to all these different things. But I think we all share the same set of cultural values. And I think that that's what I would say is Uber has a set of cultural values that everybody believes in at the company. And then there are all these like micro cultures and climates with Eats or rides or Jump or Freight. And that's what's really important is maintaining the things that make you unique and also the things that make you different. Yeah, thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so
Yeah.
much, Mike. Great job.
Thank you.
We're going to take